Hi, I'm Heidi Otway, your host for this Conversations on Cannabis virtual forum brought to you by the Medical Marijuana Education and Research Initiative at Florida A&M University. In this conversation, we're talking about the recent decision to reclassify marijuana as a less dangerous drug. So let's talk and learn about this subject with our guests. Sharon James is a nationally recognized speaker, educator, and attorney who specializes in regulatory and policy matters. She's also served clients in the cannabis industry. Sharon, welcome to the forum. Tell us more about yourself.
Hi, Heidi. Happy to be here. Again, I am Sharon James. I am a regulatory lawyer and public policy strategist involved in highly regulated industries like cannabis. And I'm glad to be here to share some insight about this important topic.
All right, Sharon, well, it's good to have you on the forum today. Our next guest is Michelle Foy, the CEO of Prestige Screening, a 24/7 national provider of workplace safety and compliance, including drug testing services. Michelle, welcome to the forum. Tell us about yourself and how you got involved in marijuana education.
Thank you so much, Heidi, and nice to see you, Sharon. I am Michelle Foy. I'm CEO of Prestige Screening. We provide 24/7 and national services to ensure that truck drivers are tested for drugs and are physically fit to be on the road to deliver all of the amazing goods that we all so desperately need, among many other things. I actually am a corporate technologist. And I got into drug testing 5 years ago due to the tragedy of losing my son, DJ, to a drug deal, a marijuana drug deal, as a matter of fact, gone bad.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that story. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the show. To everyone joining us on this live program, please share, post, and tag a friend on Facebook to have them join this conversation. If you're on YouTube, share the link so others can join us as well. During the forum, we want you to send us your questions in the comment box, and we'll do our best to have our guests answer them. We also want you to tell us what you think about this forum by completing the survey that will be posted in the comment boxes on YouTube and Facebook after this live program. Your name will be entered into a drawing on June 6th, 2024 to win a $100 gift card provided by one of Mary's partners. Now, let's start this conversation on cannabis. So, Sharon, I'm going to start with you to kind of help plant the flag and explain to our viewers, what does it mean to reclassify a drug? And as for those who are listening, this month, the Biden administration announced that it is preparing to reclassify marijuana from a Schedule 1 drug to a Schedule 3. So, Sharon, what does that mean?
Thank you, Heidi. It's really important to understand what reclassification means. And essentially, in its most simplest form, is changing the legal status of a drug under the Controlled Substance Act. And this act has been around for a number of years. It places drugs into 5 different categories. And so reclassification is the legal process that the federal government uses to change the classification of a drug from one to the other.
Okay, so what are the steps and the process involved in doing this?
So the steps involved in the reclassification is essentially the same process that a state or federal government agency uses to pass a rule or change a rule, which is how laws are essentially implemented. And so for reclassification, there are, essentially 3 phases. One of the phases is to initiate the action, then the agency develops the action, and then they pass it finally. Interestingly, and I know we'll talk about this a bit more, we're in the last of the 3 phases of the process in the reclassification process for marijuana.
Really? Okay, so is this unusual? And when was the last time the federal government decided to reclassify a drug?
It is. It's very unusual. And what makes this even more unusual and important is the potential of reclassifying marijuana, has the effect of being transformative. And so there have been other drugs that have been reclassified. I'll highlight a couple. One of the most recent ones was in 2018, where the federal government reclassified a specific derivative of CBD so that it could be used for those that have severe epilepsy. There was also a change in 2014 related to hydrocodone as a result of some of the opioid abuse epidemic and the challenges we face there. So it has happened. It just doesn't happen very often. And it is a pretty lengthy process.
Wow. So Michelle, you're in the drug testing business. So maybe you can help our audiences know, what drugs are currently scheduled as classified as Schedule 1 along with marijuana.
Absolutely. So there are a number of drugs that are actually under Schedule 1, and some of them are, things that we're familiar with, such as marijuana. You also have ecstasy. You have LSD as an example. And then there are some things that, many may not know about, such as bath salts, right? You don't hear a lot of conversation around bath salts, right? When it comes to, Schedule 3, you get into more like your Tylenol with codeine, things that a pharmacist might prescribe for medical use.
Interesting. Sharon, did you want to add to that list?
Yeah, not necessarily to add to the 1 and 3 list, but I think it adds some perspective for the Schedule 2. So things like cocaine, methamphetamine,
That's Schedule 2?
fentanyl. And so when you comparing the schedules as they currently are, it's just important and helpful for us to be able to compare what the dangers that are in the various schedules. So Schedule 1, currently, again, as Michelle mentioned, marijuana. Schedule 2, which right now is considered, less dangerous, are things like cocaine and methamphetamine and fentanyl. So it's really an interesting conversation. And the fact that we're embarking on this, I think, is a very transformative and interesting time.
Wow. So Sharon, as a follow-up, who actually determines the reclassification of marijuana?
So the reclassification is really handled primarily in the executive branch of the government, the federal government, and it includes multiple agencies, including Health and Human Services, as well as the Department of Justice, which is the Drug Enforcement Administration. So together, HHS and the DEA are involved in this reclassification process.
And so will this reclassification, you think, lead to changes in marijuana laws?
It will absolutely open the door to changes in marijuana laws. Again, keep in mind that marijuana is regulated at the federal and state level. And so this conversation and this reclassification is federal in nature and will impact, a few areas, but it will definitely open the door. And I know we'll talk a bit more about those specific areas, but it will definitely open the door to changes in the marijuana regulation and the impact that it has on research and business.
Yeah, well, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the difference between maybe the federal and state reclassification. You're based in Florida, Michelle, you're based in Georgia. I'm just curious about, in both states, if I recall, didn't Georgia just approve medical?
So we do have a form. I would call it a form of medical marijuana. This is one of those things, Heidi, where you really do have to have proper context because things can get generalized and confused really fast, right? And so there's an oil. If I am not mistaken, in Georgia, it's actually a oil and not necessarily the dispensaries and different things that are legal here in Georgia.
And then Sharon, can you provide context about what's legal in the state of Florida when it comes to cannabis use?
Yes, so Florida is very specific in terms of the use of marijuana. We have legalized medical marijuana, but it is narrow in that it is for particular specific medical conditions. And if you meet the definition based on the medical condition, receive a certification from a physician, receive an identification card, then you're able to receive medical marijuana through the dispensary. And so, again, that's the state regulatory scheme for marijuana. Recreational is not legal. And so this would have an impact on the interplay between state regulation and federal regulation. And it's still quite unknown what that interplay is actually going to look like.
Yeah, well, that's like a good setup for the question I wanted to ask you regarding the upcoming election this November. Florida voters will have the opportunity to decide if recreational marijuana should be legal. So what do they need to know about the reclassification as it relates to this?
I think the most important thing for voters to be aware of is that there is a distinct line between the federal regulation of marijuana and the state regulation of marijuana. And if voters choose up or down, what the federal government does will ultimately have an impact in Florida, but to what extent is still very much unclear. So voters have to be just as educated about federal policy and federal marijuana issues as they are about the state, and not confuse the two, which can sometimes be very difficult.
Yeah. We've had a number of medical doctors and physicians and researchers on the show. And one of the things they said about, because of marijuana's current classification status, there isn't a lot of research on how marijuana works on the body, as far as on human beings, I'll put it like that. So Michelle, because you work in an industry where you're testing people who are using these products and others, how does the reclassification impact marijuana research?
Absolutely. So I think, first of all, Heidi, I think that there are some groups that would probably argue that there is a lot of research that has been done and that can be done, to be honest. Take, for example, a group like Parent Action Network. They have a lot of research that is done on marijuana, just if you want to get more information. But the rescheduling of marijuana would no longer require a researcher to have a license, right? Because marijuana is currently a Schedule I drug. There is a very procedural, there's some tight loop, some tightness, restriction around how do you get a license to actually perform research and different things like that. So it definitely would make room for more research, which makes sense, because if we were to loosen the restriction of marijuana, shift it from Schedule I to Schedule III, we need to know so much more about the way that it's going to be reintroduced, right, into our communities.
Interesting. Sharon, did you want to add to that?
Sure. And I would just add in agreement that right now there's limited research. And interestingly, in order to do research related to marijuana, that particular marijuana that you're studying can only be received through one entity. And so what this does is it could potentially open up the ability for researchers to test other types of marijuana and the impact that it has on the body. So it is, it has been very limited. So an example is if someone is interested, or an institution is interested in studying the impact that marijuana has on chronic pain, right now they're not able to do that unless they receive the marijuana from, one particular place. And so it's been very difficult, almost impossible, to be able to test other types of marijuana to see how it impacts chronic pain. So that, again, there are pros and cons, and that's an example of the research opportunities that could potentially be made available as a result of the rescheduling.
Yeah, and I can imagine that another issue that the general public is probably asking right now since this announcement is whether the reclassification will lead to the legalization or the decriminalization of marijuana in the U.S. Sharon, what do you think?
So again, it's interesting because of the complexities coming from a regulatory standpoint. There are a lot of regulatory complexities and hurdles that have to be overcome, one in the reclassification, but also in the potential decriminalization. But one thing that was interesting as I began my research, the proposed rule that the Drug Enforcement Administration has released was very clear. The actual proposed rule that was released says that even if it were rescheduled, the manufacture, distribution, dispensing, and possession of marijuana would remain subject to the applicable criminal prohibitions of the Controlled Substance Act. And that's clear in the rule. And it's also important to note, again, that federal and state interplay is that states have regulations and rules related to the criminal aspect of marijuana, and those would remain in place, and states would still have the opportunity to enforce those as they saw fit. So I think it opens the door, but it's not automatic, and that's something that's important for folks to know.
Yeah, interesting. Michelle, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I definitely would just piggyback on what Sharon is saying. And there's a lot of opportunity. There's an opportunity for us to improve certain things, but without proper research, investigation, analysis, and process definition, conclusively, right, comprehensively, there's also a lot of opportunity for us to create some chaos. So I think it's a 50-50 right now, Heidi and Sharon, as to like how it would go. Probably going to be very tough for us to make, surefire predictions without having, representatives from different facets of this issue, at a table and contributing to the conversation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so maybe, Michelle, you can kind of answer this next question. What do you think the pros and cons are of this changing classification?
Oh, wow. So many. So I'll take the pros first. So from a pro perspective, I would go back to the research aspect. Some of the things that Sharon mentioned, we have an opportunity to look at research marijuana from different perspectives, angles that we had not previously had, right? So I definitely think the research is a pro because we can make more informed decisions with that information. It's not theory, it's actual research, data and facts. I would say that's probably the number one pro. The con is, remember at the beginning, I mentioned those truck drivers, and I say truck drivers because, truck drivers that's something everybody can understand. And I want to make sure that people know that those truck drivers have to pass a drug screen to get on the road and to stay on the road. Okay. So those truck drivers, if this gets moved to a Schedule 3, if marijuana gets moved to Schedule 3, I want everyone to absolutely be aware that those truck drivers will no longer be tested for marijuana because the DOT panel runs off that Schedule 1. Now, I would imagine that DOT may come back. Again, there may be some further conversation and decisions made, but those truck drivers could absolutely no longer have to be tested for marijuana. And that's when you need to start kind of looking into the implications of being under the influence of a certain type of marijuana while you're on the road. So I would say that that's a con. And another important con would also be that I want to highlight for action is that employers really need to understand the implications of the rescheduling to their drug and alcohol policies and programs. We're at a point in time where it is very tough to recruit and retain talent. Very tough to recruit and retain talent. So this could create further chaos, meaning that an employer could be subject to a lawsuit, unfortunately be subject to a lawsuit if this program, their policy or their programs don't support what they're actually doing, boots on the ground. Right. It also could lead to, lower worker productivity and just, there's also the potential that you could be dealing with, THC induced psychosis on the job. So it's just a lot. I just think that there's a lot of preparation that we will all need to do as part of the rescheduling if it goes through.
And then I would wonder if in how it would impact your industry, because you all are doing these drug testings right now for employers all over the nation. If this classification changes, how, along with your industry, and you mentioned the transportation industry, first, how would it impact your industry? And are there any other industries that could be potentially impacted?
Yeah, I think that there are some in the industry who think that it will put us out of business. I would say it would absolutely not put us out of business because marijuana isn't the only thing that we test for, and marijuana isn't the only drug problem in this country, right? And I see that all the time. There are employers who have different panels, employers who have different methods. So there are just so many things. So I don't think that is going to put us as a drug testing industry out of business. I think that it actually might create more opportunity because as that research comes forward, as we start to see things materialize and actualize, there's probably still going to need to be a response from drug testing overall. So that's what I would say in terms of, and as also education and awareness. Employers might want to, call a company like ours in to say, hey, how can we be proactive in educating our employees? Can you check out our drug and alcohol policy and program? We want to be on the up and up. We don't want any risk, to our firms. We'll have to call Sharon in to represent us or something. So again, I think what it does is it creates an opportunity for us to collaborate as a community, Heidi. Maybe that's the biggest pro out of all of it. This decision, if it goes through, is going to need to bring us all to the table, and we're going to need to collaborate and figure out how to make this really work.
Sharon, did you want to add to that?
I would just add that what Michelle mentions highlights just one, the complexities and the length of time that it may take for this reclassification, if it passes, to really trickle down and impact people's lives in the industries. The example with Department of Transportation, this reclassification would definitely trigger the need to change rules within DOT and other agencies. And so that doesn't happen overnight. And so we'll be seeing for years the impact of the reclassification if it passes on our lives and industries.
Well, that's a good question. What you just said makes me wonder, and maybe this, if the reclassification is approved, when will it take effect?
That's a great question, Heidi. So just a couple of things in terms of timeline. As I mentioned early on, we're in the beginning of the third phase of the process, which the Drug Enforcement Administration has already released its proposed rule. We're in the phase now where the DEA is taking public comment. That public comment period ends towards the end of July.
So
and
can you tell me so if people are listening and they're like, I want to comment on it, where do they go? What do they do?
The easiest thing to do is to go to the Drug Enforcement Administration's website or DOJ's website. Okay. There is a link there that gives you an opportunity to provide comment. That is a major part of the process, hearing from various stakeholders, no matter what side you're on as to the impact of the proposed rule. So that is open until the end of July. I believe that date is July 22nd. After that, the DEA has to provide a response, take in the information, and then ultimately release the final rule. And as in everything, and thank you, Michelle, for that shout out for work, there is an opportunity for this to be challenged. So I just mentioned that because I don't think we should expect any day a ruling, but once the public comment period closes, it can move rapidly. One of the things is this is clearly a Biden administration priority. And so we can expect to have the agency try at least to finalize it before the end of this calendar year, which would be the end of President Biden's term, if not before. So just in terms of timeline, the rule will have an effective date. It's usually 30 to 60 days. So I think we all just have to stay tuned for the late summer, early fall, when this will actually be finalized one way or the other.
Wow. So we may have to come back and have a second conversation on this to see after a decision is made so that we can educate our viewers and listeners on what happens after that, right? What happens after it's approved. So this has been a really informative conversation. I've learned so much, and I know our listeners and viewers have as well. So as we kind of wrap up, I want to give you all a chance to share some closing thoughts or just maybe some resources and Sharon, thank you for providing those 2 websites for folks to go and learn more, but just some closing thoughts on the reclassification and just your perspective. So Michelle, I'm going to start with you on that.
Thanks so much, Heidi. So I would just like to close with a couple of action items for the listeners and viewers. I would say, as you are making your decision on voting, just make sure that you are informed and, having valuable resources such as the ones that have been provided by Sharon, I think will empower you to make really good decisions before you cast your vote. And I would say that for employers, connecting with organizations like Mary and consultants like Sharon and myself is going to be very important so that you're making informed decisions in your companies that help you support your workforce, but also protect from a corporate responsibility standpoint, help you also protect your stakeholders and the communities and partners and clients that you have.
Sharon.
So I would like to close with folks understanding that the reclassification, if it passes, does not mean that once it's signed that marijuana is legal. It is not. That does not make it recreational. That does not automatically decriminalize it. And so oftentimes I know that we talk amongst ourselves. We follow certain bites of information through the media and may be misinformed. And so again, it's important to know that if you see on CNN or Fox News that it's been reclassified, that does not mean that you're able to go out and quote unquote enjoy if that's your pleasure. So for me, that's important. Understand that the federal change impacts research. It has some economic impact, but it does not have an immediate impact on some of our own, personal liberties. So again, check out the resources that are available and stay informed.
So Sharon and Michelle, those are great closing thoughts. And I want to thank you so much for being guests on this Conversations on Cannabis virtual forum brought to you by the Medical Marijuana Education and Research Initiative at Florida A&M University. Thank you to everyone watching this program. Tell us what you think about this forum by completing the survey posted in the comment boxes on YouTube and Facebook after this live program. If you complete the survey, your name will be entered into a drawing on June 6th, 2024 to win a $100 gift card provided by one of Mary's partners. We also want to encourage you to go to the Florida Department of Health Office of Medical Marijuana Use website to learn how to obtain a legal medical marijuana card in the state of Florida. We also encourage you to go to the Florida A&M University's Mary website to learn more about this initiative, its educational programs, and additional information about cannabis use in Florida. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi.